To be fully transparent, I didn't watch very many films in 2023. Be it a consequence of preoccupation with other life events or just a lack of money to spend on theater tickets, I missed out on many of the year's highlights. Poor Things, haven't seen it. Barbenheimer, didn't even catch one of those movies. But there was a film from last year that I made a special point to watch, and that was The Iron Claw. The story of the Von Erich wrestling family and the loss and turmoil that plagued them, centered by top of career performances from actors like Jeremy Allen White and Zac Efron. It's a movie that I couldn't miss. I've always had a real fascination with wrestling, heard stories about the type of Southern-based wrestling organizations that the film centers on as a kid of the American South, and I just felt a connection with the material and aesthetic from the moment I saw the first trailer. Now, on the other side of a few watches, I'm happy to confirm it's a film well worth seeking out, expertly telling a heartbreaking and affecting story. The movie is largely what advertising might lead you to expect, a retelling of how one of the most iconic wrestling dynasties imploded with a particular focus on character throughout it all. But don't go into this expecting yet another by-the-numbers emotional biopic. For as great as The Iron Claw is, and for how much it feels like a great biopic film, the movie is doing something so different from its peers. Very skillfully tackling its subject matter in a manner that deliberately highlights a central theme and uses the Von Erich story as a means of doing something extremely unique through filmmaking, writing, and acting. And that, today, is what I want to talk about. So, I've said this movie got me in my feelings. We've established that. But what initially pushed me to think more critically about the film as a whole was how I felt that emotional reaction. I'm a crier, I can admit that, but something about the Iron Claw hit me harder than usual, especially at the end. I watched the story of grief and pain building up an emotional reaction but never releasing it until the waterworks came and flow they did. I was a wreck by the final shot. I took a bit to turn the film over in my mind, interrogate what made it such an emotional watch for me, and why that emotional release was so focused at the finale, and then I realized what it was: restraint. The Iron Claw is a film about exaggerated, larger than life men, yes, but the skill of the film is in bringing them down to an intimately human level. And the method of doing that is absolutely restraint, as much as evident from scene one. The choice to open in the heat of a match, Fritz von Erich, the father of the von Erich brothers, slamming wildly into an opponent, building up aggression and energy only for an abrupt cut to take us outside the match, into the minutiae of financial struggle and family drama, it's a sort of mission statement for the film, setting in place not only a restraint in the filmmaking, where we are robbed of the high moments of success and fame in favor of an unflinching focus on the lows of that lifestyle, but setting in place a restraint in the characters, where we see rage, frustration, emotionality, all boiling underneath the surface, only to go unspoken. I'm kind of obsessed with this aspect of the film, specifically with how it entirely defies the conventions of what a biopic should be. I want you to consider three biopics from last year, and to further outline my point, we'll choose three that are very similar to Iron Claw on the surface. Prestige films with Oscar buzz and stellar performances from established actors. Killers of the Flower Moon, Napoleon, and Oppenheimer. I want you to focus on one aspect uniting all these films: their runtime. Between these three, the average length is about 3 hours exactly. Pretty long, but nothing too crazy for these kinds of serious, sophisticated biopics. Which makes it all the more strange that The Iron Claw barely crosses 2 hours and never even approaches 3. Is it that the film has less to say? No, this is a movie with decades to span and many characters to cover. So what allows this film to be so much shorter than its peers? Well, again, I would say it's that restraint. Biopics are expected at this point to show us artistic spins on real events and then live in those historical moments. They are films meant to hold additional weight in their subject matter and give viewers time to process events on screen. But The Iron Claw doesn't do that. Its fast pace is a consequence of never letting the characters or viewers of the film slow down. The first half of the movie shows that in abundance. It's embodied in the distant shots and stilted emotions that remain ever present, even as things trend upward for the Von Erich family, and we expect those big emotional releases. But the most interesting work with cinematic restraint comes only after the family's downward fall begins, after the comparatively idyllic beginning of the film concludes. At almost the exact midpoint of Iron Claw, tragedy strikes. David Von Erich, while doing promo for an upcoming match for the World Heavyweight title, the most coveted item in all of wrestling, passes away in a Japanese hotel room. David's fate in this film was no surprise to me. Like I said, I knew this story going in, and the film spells out David's fate in almost explicit terms in the scenes immediately prior. But his passing did catch me off guard. Where I had expected a scene of David's end and a large focus on his pivotal funeral, instead, I was met with somber news delivered at a kitchen table in almost tearless procession, a complete switch from what the passionate and loving relationship between the film's brothers might have led me to expect. And this is the trick of the Iron Claw. Setback after setback, loss after loss, the film and its characters refuse to exist in the moment, to dwell in the pain that instead goes quiet. And so that catharsis is denied for the audience as well. The motorcycle crash that takes the leg of Kerry Von Erich happens entirely off screen. All we're shown is his leg post amputation, like a segment of the movie was cut out entirely. When the youngest brother Mike takes his own life, we see the build-up, the preparation, but where the emotional release should be, we instead get this. A death revealed in long shot and later processed in another cold funeral procession, one that seems to pass by even faster than the last. To better articulate this point, I want to focus intently on the passing of David, the first real devastating moment of the film, and explore how it's processed through a collection of brief scenes. While we explore these scenes, I want to place special focus on the emotional build and denial of release within them all. On screen now is a graph mapping the trajectory of a typical scene, at least one in a normal emotional biopic akin to the Iron Claw. We'll be using the x-axis as time passed in the scene and the y-axis as the height of emotion reached. And we'll also include two key points on the graph, the two climaxes of emotional release that usually appear in an effective scene. See, emotional scenes, conventionally, follow a pretty specific pattern. Initial rise until an explosive emotional moment.
Tell you what, we could have had a good life together. A real good life. Had us a place of our own. But you didn't want it, Ennis.
Brief de-escalation.
You have no idea how bad it gets.
Another climb to explosion.
I wish I knew how to quit you.
Then a second emotional high moment, even more powerful than the last. Followed closely by a come down to close the scene.
It's all right. Damn you, Ennis.
And of course, a very special shout out to Brokeback Mountain for perfectly capturing this point. So our graph of a typical scene will ultimately look something like this. And this layout contributes to one of the most enduring components of satisfying storytelling, a basic 3-act structure. It just makes sense. But let's look at how that scene structure is challenged in The Iron Claw after the death of David. David's death is first revealed here, in a scene where Kevin returns to his father's ranch and hears the bad news. We have the build, Kevin entering and knowing something is wrong, and then the first spike when his father reveals his brother's passing.
He died in his hotel room in Japan.
We go back down in emotion as Kevin begins to process and start to climb again, racing for an even higher emotional spike as the reality of the situation sets in. We climb as Kevin questions how this could have even happened, and then hard cut to flowers and gifted food. Next, we get a scene of the remaining brothers gathered around, really feeling the weight of what has transpired. We're again on a path to release, and then we're cut off even sooner than before. As Fritz outright states, there will be no tears at this funeral. This is quickly followed by a scene of Doris, the mother, cutting herself off emotionally in the mirror, and then perhaps the scene that would demand the most emotion, one of Kevin finding David's final note to him, sent from Japan nonetheless. This discovery serves as our first emotional high moment, and then as the letter is read, we build toward tears. But they never come. Kevin quite literally walks out of the frame before we can see him be vulnerable. Yet another scene without resolution. This is itself immediately followed by a heartbreaking moment of Kevin lying despondent on a bed, close to his emotional limit. His partner enters the first emotional release of the scene, and then yet another denial before that second release can be reached.
I'm here if you want to talk.
Good.
Almost as if it's in tune with Kevin's avoidance of the situation, the film cuts exactly when Kevin decides to hold back. And then the funeral is over. A final scene of the family back together, which might have served excellently as a moment of honesty and hurt, is hijacked again by Fritz, who pivots the moment into wrestling and talks about who will take David's title match.
Everything we have ever worked for in the ring is riding on this moment.
Just 6 on screen minutes after the news of David's passing first broke, we're back in the ring. Outlined here is an example of how a traditional biopic might handle a similar event in just as many scenes, with the traditional 3-act structure of build up, release, come down, build up, release, come down. And of course, there may be variations in this layout. Some scenes can go unresolved when another immediately follows with the expected resolution. But look at the Iron Claw. Every scene remains incomplete, at least emotionally, and that's something we rarely see in big actor driven dramas such as this, and see even less in biopic films that, again, encourage staying in the moment, living in the emotions. It takes skill to do this. I think that much is obvious. If it's hard as a viewer to be stripped of satisfaction, then I imagine that goes twofold for anyone who worked on this film. But this very inspired choice to cut out emotion does leave the Iron Claw feeling cold and distant if the emotional anticipation is never capitalized upon, if the tears never come flowing. It's all well and good to subvert the traditional biopic formula in favor of something more jarring and artistic, but that has to be for a reason. So, how does the Iron Claw pay off its complicated relationship to emotion and processing? How does it make this decision work? Well, to discuss that, we must look a bit deeper toward the actual goal of the film, toward what it's trying to say. On its surface, this film is, again, a biopic, meant to tell a story based on real events. But in practice, The Iron Claw might as well be its own fiction, with its own motive for telling the story. These characters were real people. Many of these events did happen, but in the context of the film, characterization and plot are largely informed by where the story needs to go so it can articulate a central point. And so, we should pay close attention to how the story presents its cast and what the story chooses to show. Why is Fritz, the patriarch of the family, such an overbearing and approval-based person? Why do we focus so intently on scenes of frustration, depression, and failure? And why does our protagonist show so often an incredible, emotional, vulnerable, and soft side of himself? Didn't we come for wrestling? Well, drawing all those disparate choices together, we're left with a message. One very pointedly about masculinity. The Iron Claw is a movie about men, more particularly about toxic male attributes and how men might best grow out of unhealthy cycles of emotional repression. We see Fritz passing these generational curses down to his sons, see firsthand the toll those curses take on them, and learn to love our lead, Kevin, for how he overcomes the philosophy instilled into him since birth. Every choice in the film serves the message, and so it should come as no surprise that the very restrained nature of the movie is inherent to paying off the commentary on masculine values here. We are put in the boots of men raised by a father bent on seeing them successful and strong. And we are forced to feel intimately every moment when they want so desperately to ask for help, but aren't able to. We as viewers feel robbed of emotional fulfillment because the characters do as well. We move through tragedy after tragedy with such speed, not as a control for time, but because our characters do as well. This is a subtle but incredibly effective method of outlining the turmoils of male mental health, how men are encouraged to be stoic and strong and fall into vicious cycles of self loathing when pain makes them feel weak, and feeling weak makes them feel pain. What all of this builds toward is a supremely touching finale. What ties the whole movie together and makes it worth the journey, no matter how tough and isolating it can be at points. Carrie Von Erich, who we know to be struggling with depression and anger, calls up his last remaining brother, Kevin. He calls for help, making him the first brother to do so in the movie, but it's too little too late. Kevin rushes to find Carrie, but a single shot rings out before he can do anything. He finds Carrie laid out beside a tree, and for a brief moment, I think we're led to expect more of the same. The camera stays back, as it has time and time again in moments of great pain and shock across the film. Carrie lies obscured, suggesting we might not even see Kevin's response to his passing. But then we push in. We see Kevin break, finally, a sea of rage and then of sadness as he berates his father and then refocuses on his late brother. He brings Carrie into the house, and we sit with the anguish of it all, as Kevin does. We are brought along on his fantasy of an afterlife for his brothers, brought along on this much needed moment of intimate grief. And for the first time in the film, the tragedy of it all is allowed a space to breathe. It no longer looms in the background, but consumes the frame. And then we get the final scene. What might have devastated me more than any other film moment of the last year. Looking out on his own two sons, Kevin finally lets go completely, breaking down in the pain of all that he's experienced. His claim that men don't cry here and the response from his children that everyone cries solidifies completely the goal of the Iron Claw for me. To tell a true story, yes, but to do it in a way that centers so completely male repression and shines a light on those masculine mental health issues that seem to become more pressing each day. Ones that have such a way of locking onto the lives of men like a vice grip and never letting go. And that's why the novel approach here to emotional storytelling works so well. It's not just some empty stylistic choice, a byproduct of the show don't tell philosophy drilled into the brain of every film student, but an active story decision that makes this singular moment of emotional release from Kevin feel like the breaking of a dam. And that's why it gets me every single time I watch it. There is a version of this film that's 3 hours long that plays up the real world events of the story for shock and viewer investment. It may even be an incredibly enjoyable watch, but this is not that film. The Iron Claw is concerned first and foremost with serving its story, with crafting a narrative that speaks volumes to the potent issues that are impossible to separate from the subject matter at play within it, even if that makes the film diverge from expectations and convention. It's a movie that, like its own lead, struggles to open up and to confront head on the tragedy at its core. And while a different film might have chosen to lead with emotionality front and center, I think the constant struggle with restraint that's evident in every scene of The Iron Claw only makes it all the more powerful when the film finally decides to let go.
Thank you, boys.
Hi guys! As always, I'm coming on here at the very end of the video to just issue a massive thank you for, you taking it upon yourself to watch my video. This one was a true labor of love. I really enjoyed the Iron Claw and I wanted to analyze it in a way that reflected my passion for it. And if I'm being honest, I think I came away with some pretty unique ideas on the film. So I hope you got something out of the video as well. I also come on here to give a massive shout out to my Patreon and all my beautiful and wonderful patrons who support me over there financially and really help me to create videos and just keep the lights on the channel. If you're at all interested in taking the next step on supporting me, Patreon is definitely the best place to do that. But if you're interested in supporting me in a non-monetary type way, I always appreciate a subscription, a comment, or turning on notifications on the channel, really anything to give me a push in the algorithm. And of course, I have to issue a very, very special shout out to all my patrons in the shout out tiers. So special thanks to the Muppet Guy, Anya May, Robin, Onyx, Sophie Villarot, Adrian_R31, Alex Mirabal, and Grace. And as always, I have been Ellie, you have been wonderful, and until next time, bye!